Hello, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, college football fans across the nation and around the world. It's yet again time for another Tim May podcast. And I'm excited about this podcast. Of course, I get excited about all my podcasts, but I've got a return of a special guest star who I really like. He should be a bigger name than he even is out there, but he is already a big name in the world of covering college football, not just Ohio State, but across the nation. Bill Bender. Bill Bender, how are you doing?
Hey, Tim, I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on today.
Oh, you're welcome, man. Ladies and gentlemen, as you know, Bill Bender works for the Sporting News, and in my opinion, is one of those experts that you can turn to get sort of an unbiased opinion of not only where, for example, Ohio State stands in the realm of things, but where everybody else does. And we're going to kind of get into a few cleaning up segments or whatever you want to call it from the 2019 season and also 2020 and how it projects. But hey, Bill, right now let's just start off with 2020 from a weird standpoint. If you had to give me a top 5 headed to spring football, you know what I mean? Talk about way too early, even though a lot of people have had top 5s out for a month now. What would be your top 5 for 2020 as you project?
Well, I think it's the top 5 that is the top 5 in the sport, not just this year, but for the foreseeable future. Tim, I've had these arguments with some buddies where I kind of tell them, just lay it out there, and I'll lay it out there for you, is there are only 5 teams that can win it all right now in college football. There really are. It's Clemson, Ohio State, Alabama, LSU, and Georgia. Those are, in my opinion, those are the only 5 teams that are capable of winning 2 playoff games. They've dominated their conferences in various forms. I mean, Georgia and LSU, not as much.
Yeah.
And they have the talent through recruiting and the ability to replace those guys better than anybody else. I guess even LSU and Georgia, we'll find out if they can do that. Alabama, Clemson, and Ohio State do that better than anybody else.
Yeah, yeah. And obviously LSU and Georgia are going to be going through a little bit of a change, from a quarterback standpoint. They lost some also key personnel, down the line, so to speak, on their teams. But you're right. I mean, they've recruited, especially Georgia has recruited at a very high level. Real quick, Bill, how old are you? You don't have to give me the exact age, but as they say on like a form you fill out, are you in the 30 to 40, the 40 to 50? What range are you in?
I'll tell you. I mean, I turned 40 in October, so I've been around long enough to see, some of the shifts in college football. And you and I have talked about this before, where everybody likes to say that college football is cyclical, but I really think these cycles are lasting a little bit longer. Yeah. Alabama's dominated the sport for almost 14 years now. Ohio State, there's no end in sight in terms of how they've dominated the Big Ten. And then, if there's no end in sight there, how do you feel if you're an ACC school not named Clemson?
Right.
And I think that's where we're at in the sport right now, where we're going to see a lot of the same names in the playoff. And the way I put it to people is this. Think about it this way. LSU Joe Burrow had the greatest passing season in SEC history. And they beat Alabama by 5 with a quarterback that had 1 leg.
Yeah.
I mean, that's how far ahead of those 3 programs are ahead of everybody else, at least in my opinion.
Yeah, yeah. I'm with you 100%. The interesting thing is Clemson, I still look at Clemson and Alabama. Everybody knows I grew up an Alabama fan, but this notion that Alabama is perpetual without the man in charge being a big difference in it is just crazy, because we all know the swoon between Gene Stallings and Nick Saban. It was real, and matter of fact, Alabama was in essence mediocre for a while there, or at least way below average. Let's put it that way for Alabama. The same way with LSU. LSU has risen again under Ed Orgeron, and the talent in that area is crazy per capita. How many football players are in the state of Louisiana, for example? And Ed Orgeron and his group have tapped into that, but will it sustain? That's they've had a real good recruiting class this year. We're working on a pretty good one for next year. But it's almost always about the man in charge. And even with Ohio State, people can knock the John Cooper years, but from 92, from 92 through 98, Ohio State was about as good as anybody in the country. They just lost a game or 2 or 8 that hurt them to prove it. If you follow my drift, but probably Ohio State has had the most just sustained excellence, if that's the right word, of being that force in their conference from like 92 or 93 until now than any of them. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, it's been over a quarter of a century. I mean, as long as you've been on the beat, they've been, I would say, I mean, you could probably speak to this better than me. I think at points in the Earl Bruce era, they weren't a valid national championship contender.
Correct.
Is that fair?
That is very fair. Yeah. And then early in the Cooper era. Yeah.
But once Cooper got rolling, like you said, around 93, 94, so we're dealing with a quarter century where, with very few exceptions, Ohio State's always been in the national championship picture from start to finish. And especially with Urban. I mean, the stat I always throw out with Urban, and you know this one, and it's just so bizarre to say this out loud, and when people from the South and other regions hear it, they kind of just they do a double take, is that, you know, since Urban Meyer took over, they've lost one Big Ten home game. One.
Yeah. Cost them real big, but one. Yeah.
1 in 8 years.
Yeah.
Is that what we're dealing with here? And that's just incredible sustained dominance over the rest of the conference. So I know we like to make it an Ohio State-Michigan thing, and it is, but it's an Ohio State and the rest of the Big Ten thing. I mean, it's not just Michigan that's behind. It's Penn State. It's the entire West Division. There's nobody that really stands up to Ohio State from a talent standpoint, and I would say in a developmental standpoint in terms of, you know, you're going to see it this week at the Combine with all these Ohio State guys and how well they do.
Yeah, yeah. And what's interesting is about the Combine being a barometer of it, it's also a harbinger, you know, because they've got all those guys going, and yet Ohio State's going to be picked to win the Big Ten again by, I think most people understood the mistake they made last year when they picked Michigan, if you follow my drift, because all you got to do is follow the recruiting rankings to take you to lead you. They're the breadcrumbs that lead you to what you should be looking at when it comes to college football powers anymore. And Ohio State's expected to reload the guys they lost. They're losing, you know, Chase Young, maybe the best defensive player in the country, maybe some people might argue the best player in the country from a year ago, yet they've got some young guys rising, et cetera. Tyreek Smith, I mean, Jonathan Cooper, Zach Harrison. Jonathan Cooper's not a young guy, but he's coming back. But you know what I'm saying? It's not – it's a reload kind of situation for them, and it's kind of hard for, I think, a lot of people to wrap their arms around. And yet, like you said a while ago, it's not so much Ohio State versus Michigan anymore. It's kind of like a tag team. The Big Ten's got a tag team on the other side of the ring, and Ohio State's taking on all comers, right?
Yeah, for sure. And I think the next part of that, though, is if you're an Ohio State fan, you're asking, well, why don't they have more national championships? It's because it's that elite weight class of 5 that I told you about. I mean, right. Georgia hasn't won it since 1980, and that's incredible to me with the talent they've had over the last 15 years. LSU, you know, they've won 3, and they last year, that was a remarkable team. Yep. And, you know, if Ohio State would have beat Clemson and played LSU, I'm not sure they would have won that game. I just think LSU was operating at a different level offensively than everybody else.
Just outscore
Clemson,
everybody. Yeah.
Right. And Clemson is recruiting at – Clemson to me, and since you dated me, Clemson to me is a little bit like – if you swap the uniforms and put Florida State uniforms on them, that's who they are. Florida State 90s teams, where
I'm with you.
They're going to be in the top 5 every year.
Yeah.
And everybody's looking. I guess I get your opinion on this because I have my own, but I think there are some small cracks in the Alabama dynasty, but I don't think they're enough to open up the dam yet. I just think that's the team that has enough talent that you can't count them out any year as long as Saban's going to be there.
Bill, see if you agree with me on this, but I in some respects, I think Nick Saban. You're gonna turn over. You're not even in your grave yet, but you're gonna turn over in it. Nick Saban is underrated, and I say this as a coach because look at the turnover he has had on his coaching staff. Okay. Over I mean, it's crazy how many guys have come and gone through there. Some of them really good, some of them not so good as they found out when they got out on their own. But it's amazing how many coaches he's gone through and yet maintained. And you know that the main reason they've maintained is because of the talent they got coming in from a player standpoint. And don't you agree that the job he's done just as a coach getting a new staff going almost every year. I mean, it's crazy.
Well, you say Saban around Columbus, and Ohio State fans like to bristle, but I mean, the truth is, and you can probably speak to this more than me since you knew from living down there. But just my experience in dealing with the Ohio State beat and the Alabama beat is you're two of the same people.
Yeah.
I mean, the Alabama fan base and the Ohio State fan base is the same. And I say that in terms of they do not believe they should ever lose a football game.
Mm-hmm.
Right, at their current state. Like Alabama doesn't think they should ever lose right now.
Right.
And some of that is the institution that Nick Saban has created. I think the best thing he's done, and if you watch, it's weird because when Alabama guys get drafted to the NFL, he almost maxes them out in college.
Yeah.
And it's a little bit tricky because they go to the NFL. It's not like they're bad, but a guy like, Minka Fitzpatrick, for example, he's really good in the NFL, but it's like he was really good in college too, in terms of he didn't really take that next step. Whereas you look at a guy like at Ohio State, Terry McLaurin took off in the NFL, and I think he kind of hit us all by surprise. He was good at Ohio State.
Yeah.
But then you realize how good he was when he gets to the NFL.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of a development kind of thing because some guys come along at different paces. The interesting thing about 5 stars coming out of high school is, okay, they've impressed you to this point. How much farther or how much further can they rise? How much higher can they rise based on their football? I mean, to me, it's always been an interest. I would almost always err on the side of 4 stars because 4 stars know there's another level they can get to if you follow my drift. But when 5 stars are coming out, I mean, how much higher can they get? And it's funny because water finds its own level. I think football talent does too. And I think you're exactly right. And then Alabama players, especially defensively, they're so used to being part of a system that I think that kind of catches up to them when they get to the NFL too. I mean, there are all kinds of reasons for the phenomenon you're talking about, but most of the time they turn out to be solid players. But there are very few Alabama guys like a Derek Thomas. You don't even remember him. He played before when you were like 10 years old probably. But a Derek Thomas who are just a cut above, and they get to the NFL and just keep rising. And I think you really hit on something there. It's really kind of intriguing to me to think about that. That's a story idea down the road, don't you think, Bill? Huh?
Well, that and here's the thing too. When you saw this, I know you have so many guys on that Ohio State beat that cover recruiting well. You got one there, Lettermen Row with Jeremy. He does second to none. So
yeah.
I say this when you watch signing day. The what I can read and look at and try to break down a little bit is you see that top 5 that I've been talking about this whole time, and they put in, I believe it was like 18 or 19 5 stars.
Yeah.
And then you look at 6 through 25, and those schools combined get like 10 or 11 5 stars. And that includes the Michigans and Penn States, where it's a celebration if they get one. One school that is doing well, and Ohio State's going to see them next year, and I think it's a year early for them, is Oregon.
Yes.
Oregon's really starting to recruit that 5-star guy, and they're taking advantage of USC being down. So I think, when you look for schools that can try to break through that, I know you wanted to talk a little bit about Texas and Oklahoma and Penn State and Michigan. They don't have that. It's just, I really think it's something to the talent gap. And, we were both there in Ann Arbor this year where Harbaugh didn't like the question, but he didn't like the question probably because you don't like the answer. And the answer is that, yes, Ohio State has a talent gap with Michigan right now.
Yeah. And it's almost like he didn't like the question because he knows the answer, like you're talking about. And you're exactly right. I mean, I think most people now would look around and those guys, it's one of those things where, you recruit those 5 stars and those high 4 stars to make a difference in the biggest games. You follow my drift, and that's where really Ohio State's, superstar kind of guys for the most part have shown. And, Justin Fields, I mean, God, if he just hadn't had that knee injury last year, who knows where they would have gone. And yet they still should have beaten Clemson, and had been in that national championship game. But you're exactly right. I mean, and it's so much now, college football is so much a function of who's at quarterback, You agree with that, I'm sure. When you look at
Oh, for
Clemson,
sure.
you look at Alabama, you look at Ohio State last year, it is such a function of that. And even Oklahoma, when you named your five, I don't think you named Oklahoma, but Oklahoma is just that kid on the block that won't go away. It just can't win the big one, right, anymore. I mean, it can't win in the playoffs.
Right. Well, and that's just it. I mean, because how many times do you need to see it? This year was kind of
Yeah.
the difference with Oklahoma and those guys is, and I know it's a style of play. Yeah, they have great offenses, great skill position talent. CD Lamb, you're going to see him at the combine do some pretty cool things.
Yes.
But I think it's on the interior, on both sides where they just, well, maybe more on the defensive side than the offensive side, where the defense, they couldn't stop LSU at any point in that game.
Yeah.
They couldn't stop Georgia when it mattered. They couldn't stop Alabama when it mattered. I think, Ohio State and Oklahoma had a back and forth, but it took, if you look at the second game, it took, in what my estimation, and I'm sure you've seen a better performance than Baker at Ohio Stadium at night, but I haven't. And it took that kind of performance to beat the Buckeyes at night for Oklahoma. So
yeah.
I think those are, they're there. They're in that second class, though, with the Notre. I would say if I was to name 6 or 7 programs that are still trying to knock on that door, it's, Florida and Notre Dame and Texas and Alabama, or Texas and Oklahoma, Michigan, Penn State, and I would say Oregon. Oregon's getting closer to me. I mean, they've proven it to me, what they did in the Rose Bowl. So that's kind of that class of like 12 teams. Maybe you want to put Wisconsin in there, that's fine. I'll believe Wisconsin can win a national championship when I see them beat Ohio State on the biggest stage.
Yeah.
Which what are we on? 3 of them where they haven't?
Yeah. First get into the college football playoff once, Yeah, I see what you're saying there. Yeah. Exactly. Hey, I wanted to ask you, what just before we move on to a couple other topics, what is your take on Ohio State going into spring, going into this season? What is it that you're intrigued about learning maybe in the spring about them? Obviously, you've got Justin Fields back. You've got I was playing golf yesterday, as a matter of fact. It was over in Richmond, Indiana, with a buddy of mine, and we were talking about this. One of those few days in February, but you got to grab it, right? But anyway, we were talking about this. I said, some of these guys I'm talking about are untested, like Julian Fleming, Mookie Cooper, but I have never seen as deep a talent well at wide receiver at Ohio State as I see going into 2020. And, for example, I expect Ohio State to revert back to maybe a little bit more of a 2018 approach, maybe throw a little bit more than they did in 2019, because Justin Fields is going to be an improved passer, I do believe. I watched him and his group go through some off-season throwing session last week, and I was very impressed by what I saw. Just because I was there doing this podcast, and I don't know. Ohio State intrigues me because they can be almost a chameleon offensively of whatever it is they want to be, and I'm just wondering what you see there.
Yeah, you kind of stole my thunder there, because I was going to talk about the receiving group. Well, the one I'll talk
go ahead.
about then.
No, go ahead.
Garrett Wilson's going to take that next step to superstar.
Oh, yeah.
I think that's something we're all going to. I mean, you saw flashes of it this year.
Yeah, like lightning.
I think that's coming. Anytime you lose a guy like J.K., it's a concern. But again, this kind of circles back to what we talked about at the top. So Alabama loses Tua Tagovailoa, and to me, they still won at the deadline because they kept guys like Najee Harris and Devontae Smith and a couple others.
Yeah.
Now, Ohio State, to me, despite losing J.K. and Chase and Jeff, the corner, Okudah, to the draft, they won to me because they kept their offensive linemen.
Exactly.
They had this. There were some guys on the fence that stayed, and to me, you knew. I mean, nobody was like, "Oh, Chase Young's definitely going to stay," or J.K. should stay. No, those guys are gone. That means you've done your job. So,
yeah.
And I think defensively, there's probably a few question marks there, but not really. I mean, it's just a talent backfill on the back seven. I think the biggest loss Ohio State had on defense was Jeff Hafley.
Yeah.
Because of what he did is from the coaching standpoint. I got a chance to talk to him last week, and that's a star right there. He's going to be a star at Boston College and moving forward.
But hey, but let me interrupt you. But even
Go
if
ahead.
he'd stayed, he would have been here just this year probably anyway. Anymore.
Right.
I mean, I'm with you. But go ahead. I mean, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No,
I
you're
agree with
good.
everything you've said. The
So,
other,
so
but you're right. I mean, I think Wyatt Davis at right guard. Wyatt Davis might be the best lineman in the country this year. He could be perceived as that as the season approaches. Josh Myers is huge, but like you said, the interesting thing about Ohio State is what do you do with Harry Miller? This very talented freshman center they got last year, who, as the season went on, I mean, he improved, but he got to play in mop-up time for the most part. But now you plug him in at left guard, which is really, the only. I mean, obviously they lost their right tackle in Brandon Bowen, but they've got a rising star there in Nicholas Petit-Frere. So do you get Harry Miller on the field somehow? Because he is that 5-star talent, to go next to Thayer Munford. I mean, what's your take on that?
yeah, you got to try to get him in there, and I think they will. And the fortunate thing is they're going to beat some teams by enough points that he'll get to play. And again, it's just that offensive line continuity will matter.
Yeah.
And Fields really makes it go, and that's why you're going to see Ohio State when the preseason polls come out. They're probably going to be number 2 across the board behind Clemson, because Clemson has Trevor back and Travis back. Travis Etienne staying for them was huge.
Yes.
And they're recruiting at the same level as Ohio State. So, I mean, for all the bad feelings about that semifinal game last year, you're probably going to see them play each other again, whether it's in the 4 or the 2 next year. I mean, that's just the way it looks off the surface. So, yeah, I think Ohio State has just – in terms of the spring, though, I think last year there was this fascination factor with how would Ryan Day do, what would the transition look like? Well, transition just went into hyperspeed. They're just taking what Urban did and picking up where he left off and adding a personal touch to it. And I think Ohio State's just business as usual. It could actually be a boring spring game, Tim. I hate to say it.
I'm with you.
Because I think we don't have any pressing questions about the team.
Yeah, the only pressing question really is who's going to be the backup quarterback. Will Gunnar Hoke prevail? Will C.J. Stroud or Jack Miller step up? I mean, interestingly, they're going to have a true freshman, as I keep telling Boston, him as Austin Ward, that they're going to have a true freshman quarterback is going to be at least third team. There's a good chance that one of those guys could rise into that second team category. So, but you and I both know Tua Tagovailoa, Trevor Lawrence, as John Cooper used to say, if they're going to bite you, they're going to bite you as a pup, and so the trepidation by coaches playing freshman quarterbacks anymore in key roles, I think, is out the window, especially when the czar of them all, Nick Saban, did that a couple of years ago with Tua. You agree?
Yeah, and he may do it again this year with Bryce Young.
Exactly.
If Bryce Young's ready, even though they do have Mac Jones on the roster and he got some valuable reps down the stretch. But, that's one of those openers when they play USC. That could happen, depending on if Bryce Young's ready or not.
Yeah.
Nick's not going to tell you till, what is that, September 5th. We're not going to know.
Don't ask me that question. That's
you won't know till they have the ball. But I think all of those things are definitely part of the game now. And I mean, Justin Fields, the confidence. I think one of the things I missed last year was I didn't realize how quickly he would get comfortable in Ryan Day's offense.
Yeah.
How just seemed it really was. He got comfortable early, never really stopped. I mean, you look at the numbers, that's just ridiculous. And I think, like you said, if that gets better, you wonder what the ceiling is.
Yeah. Well, that's the interesting thing. I forgot the player that said this when I asked them when did they feel that confidence in Justin Fields, and they said, well, through preseason or off-season and preseason, he was playing pretty well. But when he took off on that long touchdown run for his first touchdown, when all of a sudden you realize there was a new sheriff in town and his name was Justin Fields, the Dwayne Haskins Jr. Era, short as it was in the rearview mirror as far as folks were concerned. And that's funny where that's going. I mean, Trevor Lawrence, the one thing Justin Fields reminded people about before that bowl game was that Trevor Lawrence was a good runner. He didn't think he got enough credit for being a runner. And if Trevor Lawrence hadn't pulled those couple of runs, especially the long one for a touchdown out of his back pocket, I think Ohio State wins that game handily. But he put that team on his back. They got him going again, and then they win that game. That was impressive. I don't know if you agree or not, but you were there if I remember correctly. I can't remember which game you went to. Did you go to?
No, I was at the championship game.
Yeah.
So this is the world we live in 2020 with covering this sport. So
yeah, I'm with you.
Trevor Lawrence was phenomenal in the final 2 minutes against Ohio State. They did an excellent job of kind of getting to him early in that game. I think where Clemson beat Ohio State in almost reverse order. They did it with Trevor Lawrence's legs and Travis Etienne on the screens.
Right.
Which is not how they beat 99% of the teams they beat. They do it the other way. And then when they got to the championship game, Trevor Lawrence didn't have a good game. He missed guys on third down. They had a good game plan, though, early. And there was even a point in that game, and it was 28-25, and Clemson had the ball. And I was thinking in my head, Tim, sitting there in the Superdome, and I thought, they're going to win this game. They're going to win. They're going to find a way to beat LSU. And, of course, Joe Burrow turned that the other way. But Lawrence is fine. My point is, then it started, Trevor Lawrence is overrated. He's inaccurate, blah, blah, blah. No, he's not.
No,
he's going to be really good this year. And I think they're going to win the ACC again, and they're going to be right back there in the playoffs. And, again, it's hard not to – if I had to – I always play this game every year where, if I had to get one playoff team right, I only have to get one and I win my money or whatever.
Yeah.
Pick Clemson every year now.
Oh, yeah.
Because they've got the easiest path. I mean, you never know. Ohio State could go slip up in the whiteout. They could. I don't think they will. But, and then Ohio State would be my second choice just because show me somebody else that can win the Big Ten right now.
Yeah, yeah. And the thing about it is I think the Big Ten's pretty damn good, but it's just – Ohio State is just that little bit better, you know what I mean, across the board, and that's where it pays for you. Like you said, though, you can be just a little bit better, but you can have that slip-up. You can have that Iowa. You can have that Purdue game that you just go, where in the hell did that come from?
Right.
And Clemson almost had it last year, I mean, if North Carolina beats Clemson, you think Clemson gets in the playoff if North Carolina beats Clemson? I don't think so.
Close.
I don't think
it's been close.
It would have been a close vote, man. I mean, it would have been interesting. It helped them, of course. It would have helped the cause of what went on in the Pac-12 championship game, the Pac-12. But I digress. Hey, real quick, I want to move on to this because I wanted to ask you about this earlier. When you look at Texas and you talk about landing on a planet, that has all the talent in the world around to gather and bring to the home base and get things done. That's where Texas sits the University of Texas sits in Texas with all that football being played. I mean, I was just down in Texas visiting with my mom a couple of weeks ago, and Lufkin, my old hometown, I mean, they've got an indoor facility, but they were going through off-season workouts and stuff like college teams do, and they'll have spring football, et cetera. And that's the head start that kind of Ryan Day was talking about players from Texas, what they come in with, that maybe a lot of other places you don't get that from. And, obviously Georgia, Alabama, Florida, I think they all have spring football, et cetera. But, what is your sense of what's going on at Texas? Obviously Tom Herman reached out and grabbed Mike Yurcich from Ohio State to come there and be his offensive coordinator, new offensive coordinator. He just hired Chris Ash, former Ohio State defense coordinator, who flopped as a head coach at Rutgers. But a lot of people, that's not a big that's kind of like an oxymoron, flopped at Rutgers, except for Shiano, who hasn't. But my point is, what's your sense? Is your sense that Tom Herman's getting his act together down there, or you sense there's a desperation?
I think getting Ellinger back's huge. I think Tom Herman's upgraded the talent there through the recruiting. He hasn't,
Agreed.
When he got there, Ohio State was taking all those kids from Texas. It was like open borders. And one of the things that has happened since Jimbo and Tom have been hired down there is they haven't closed the border, but they've kept enough guys in Texas that they're going to be okay.
Yeah.
Now, I think the next part of that, Tim, is okay, well, he can recruit. Now, can he coach? And they've lost a lot of close games. And in the Big 12, you play close games. But to me, if Texas loses to LSU, that's fine. If Texas loses a close one to Oklahoma, okay. I mean, those teams are – but Texas can't be losing a field goal game to TCU or Iowa State or,
right.
Have a nail-biter with Kansas as much as I love Les. And you look at his record in one-score games, it's not great. And that's where we get into this year is they have to go down to Baton Rouge. they play Oklahoma early, and they do have Ellinger back, and I like that. And I picked them to make the playoff last year. That was probably one of my bigger misses. But I really thought the momentum would carry over. And sometimes when you lose too early in the season, like they did, the rest of the year can go under. So yeah. I can say, yeah, it was a horrible pick. Sure, that's fine. But I don't feel as bad about that as I should.
Well, the interesting thing, I think a lot of people did that. I called it sort of the Ohio State syndrome too. Anybody but Oklahoma. It was kind of the, you know what I mean? I think the battle cry down there in the Big 12. And I tell you what, think about this, man. 3 straight times Lincoln Riley, or they've gotten to the playoffs with 3 straight transfer quarterbacks. I mean, obviously Baker Mayfield had been there for a couple of years, but that's amazing what Lincoln Riley and Oklahoma have done just in perpetuating with guys who weren't there a year ago sometimes and 2 years ago. But I don't know. Where do you see Oklahoma fitting in that mix now with Texas? Because I think Texas, in my opinion, I don't even call it a dark horse pick. I think they could be pretty good this year, based not just on the personnel they've got, but the coaching staff that they've put together. I mean, I think Yurcich is back in his bailiwick, and I think Chris Ash made an instant improvement at Ohio State from a tackling standpoint, et cetera. Hey, and that's what's been missing at Texas in some key moments in games. So we'll see where that goes. But do you see this as a chance for Texas to supplant Oklahoma?
It is. I mean, and they, it's Tom's beat Lincoln at least once.
Yeah.
And they hadn't beat them on the big stage, and there's that chance for them to really do that. And Oklahoma, I mean, I think Texas is always going to face the same hype, expectations, questions that they always face. Now, Oklahoma, I think this year in particular, is going to have their big boy credentials questioned a little bit in terms of, we've seen you, you win the Big 12, that's great, and then you go to the playoff and get stomped. So I think both of those programs have a lot on the line. I think Oklahoma State's going to get in the mix there too, with the guys that they haven't come back with Mike Gundy. This is one of those years where I think they could get back in that, have one of their years that they've had a couple.
Yeah, they've been exactly. Close. I agree.
They're right in the mix there, where if they take care of business early, the Bedlam game could be huge. It's in late October. So all of those things are going to come into play at the Big 12, and I don't think Oklahoma is head and shoulders above any of those teams as much as they normally are. But I think, then again, I said the same thing last year, and Jalen Hurts was a Heisman finalist. So it's on somebody to go out and beat Oklahoma before we can actually say that.
Yeah, I'll tell you what, though, real quick, I want to ask you one other thing. We'll get going, but about Oklahoma. I can't imagine Oklahoma without Jalen Hurts last year, because he pulled a few games just right out of his his rear pocket, excuse me. I mean, it was crazy. Yeah. I'm looking, I'm going, okay, but what would that team have been like without him? And then, you could say that about other quarterbacks too, but there were times when he just said, we're not going to lose, and they didn't, after they did lose. But and I'm not sure they've got that kind of player now at quarterback, so that's going to be interesting, Real quick, though, but they get into playoffs because, once again, the Pac-12 stumbles, because I think you could almost sense the committee wanted anybody other than Oklahoma, at one point last year, but the Pac-12 couldn't put forth that viable candidate. Do you see that possibility in Oregon this year? And obviously what I'm leading up to here is the big showdown is coming. Ohio State at Oregon early in September is going to kind of pave the way for either one of those two teams. But do you see Oregon having that capability?
Yeah. I think, they got, if you look at Oregon's season last year, they're in the playoff, if not for a 2-minute hiccup against Auburn, where they won that game for 3.5 quarters and they let Auburn get back in, and they just didn't close the door. Otherwise, they're in the playoff.
Right.
And I don't know that they beat LSU either, but what Mario's done is he's recruited well on the defensive side of the ball. They've got different athletes than they did when they played Ohio State in the national championship game, where I think we both knew, and I saw that matchup, I was like, there's no way Ohio State's losing this game.
Right.
Because they're better up front on both sides.
Right, not that, but you take Mariota out of the mix, and oh my goodness, that was that's why I looked at it. But go ahead, though. You're right.
But yeah. Well, now they're getting kids like Kayvon Thibodeau, who that's first-round pick.
Yeah,
top 5 pick, probably off the edge. They're getting a freshman linebacker like Justin Flo, who he'll play some next year, and he'll remind people He's one of those guys. I'm not going to do a Ray Lewis comparison, but the style is very similar, and how he hits and how he plays side to side. They've got players.
Yeah.
And I think they're a year early, and losing Herbert hurts. But in terms of just taking advantage of how bad USC is, nobody's done that more than Oregon.
Yeah. Hey, does USC what happens there? I'm almost whispering. I don't know why, because it's one of the blue bloods has just lost its way like Prince Andrew or something.
Yeah. Well, no, I think Clay Helton. I'm surprised they didn't move on, just because we're going to do the same questions this year, and they play Alabama again in the opener. So you're starting 0-1, and then you get into their first half of the season. Schedule's rough. They play Stanford, they play Utah, they play Washington in there, and it's not going to be easy. And for that program, it's just shocking to me that I know they can recruit, I know they can develop, but I think some of that's administration on down. So, I think the new AD, guy from Cincinnati, obviously, is going to have a decision to make next season. And I don't know what you do. I don't know what the answer is. I think Clay Helton's done okay. But again, they're kind of in that same spot as Michigan and Penn State, where okay is 10 wins, but in the college football playoff era, okay needs to be, or better than okay needs to be 13, 14 wins, and have a team that's got enough depth to win too.
Yeah. Is it unfair to look at them though, through the prism, if that's even the right term, maybe the looking glass of what they used to be? You follow my drift? Is it fair? Because sometimes programs lose their way and never really kind of get back. It takes a long time. I'm trying to think of an example. Clemson won a national championship under Danny Ford, but then Clemson became just sort of that mediocre good team. You know what I'm saying? Forever, until Dabo took over, and then they took it back to the next, to that high level. And I don't know. What's your take on that?
Well, I think, they can still win there. Pete Carroll won there, and it wasn't that long ago. And I know the thing I was saying all along is, if Urban ever took that job, he could win there too.
I agree. Because he could. Well, that's what I'm getting to. It is the guy. That's what I was talking about when we started this whole thing. It is the guy that's running the show that does make the biggest difference in college football. I think you agree with me on that.
Oh, yeah. Urban would win there like Pete did. He'd probably do it faster because he recruits better. I think that's half the battle there, is you have to have the entire organizational approach from the top down. And right now, Ohio State has that. Has it been perfect? No. You had the suspension with Urban Meyer 2 years ago, and Gene Smith got suspended. But in general, I would even say, for all the knocks on Meyer back then, player behavior was pretty good under his. There was an incident here or there, but nothing too bad. And I know there was the incident with the two Ohio State players a couple weeks ago, but I don't think like Ryan Day's running something out of Pony Express or something like that. They've had a pretty good behaved, or in terms of player behavior. Yeah, they're fine. So that's part of it too. And right now, again, it kind of brings our whole conversation full circle. Is Alabama, Clemson, Ohio State, they do that better than everybody else. Georgia and LSU, they're probably the next best. And then everybody else is kind of trying to figure out the formula, trying to figure out that way to win big at the table. And it's been a struggle for some of those other teams. Like for example, I'll just come out and say it. I don't think Jim Harbaugh's done a bad job at Michigan. I just think he inherited a program that was a little bit behind, and just for whatever reason, instead of closing the gap in 5 years, the gap has gotten better between those two programs, despite the success he's had against other teams.
Yeah, I agree. And I always use auto racing analogies, but it's like when you get into you build a new car, but and you hope it's going to be competitive, but the other guy has been working on his car for a couple, 3, 4, 5 years and has honed it. You know what I mean? It's hard to play catch up is the whole thing without just a shot of high octane, a couple of 4 or 5 big time players that just make the difference. And they can make the difference in those kind of games. And that's really who Michigan hasn't gotten yet. I mean, they thought they had gotten a transfer like that in Shea Patterson, but he didn't really turn out to be that quarterback, or at least they didn't match him with the offense maybe that would have he would have played better in and been more effective. And I think it's been interesting to watch that, because you can't turn your back on the transfer portal anymore, and they haven't, by the way. But the flip side of it is you gotta hit gold when you get that transfer portal, and some teams have done that, like like Oklahoma did last year with Jalen Hurts, like Ohio State did with Justin Fields, and some haven't.
Yeah, for sure. And I think Michigan definitely, there'll be the same old questions about them, but they're not going to fire him, I don't think. I just think I always pull out these stats with him. Everybody likes the top 10 teams and that, the Ohio State stat, which is 0-5, and Glaire's probably shines bigger than anything else. But I mean, I told people, like, if you're going to give Jim Harbaugh credit for anything, give him credit for taking the state back, because Michigan State's a mess, and such a mess that Luke Fickell wouldn't even take that job. He's played even with Wisconsin and Penn State. People act like Penn State and Wisconsin have dominated them, but Jim Harbaugh wasn't brought to Michigan to compete with Wisconsin and Penn State. He was brought on to, it's the fact that they haven't won a Big Ten championship since 2004. It's kind of amazing. He was brought on to close this gap with Ohio State, and it just hasn't happened. They've had chances. I mean, the 16 team was good enough to do it. The last 2 years they were good enough to probably win that game, but that was the whole thing: the execution, the game plan, the talent gap, and all those things. Last year they had to play a perfect game to have a chance, and they left, I think, 2 scores on the board in the first quarter, and you just kind of knew this is over.
Yeah, interesting. By the way, Mel Tucker, how do you think he'll do at Michigan State?
The one thing he does do is recruit.
Yes,
pretty well. He learned that at Georgia and Alabama, and
Ohio State.
They had a better Colorado had a better recruiting. And Ohio State. Colorado had a better recruiting class than Michigan State this year.
Yes.
So that's one thing. Now the other part of it is.
Well, wait, let me interrupt you. The problem is he can't bring that recruiting class with him.
Well, that and D'Antonio went 7. I pulled this stat out a lot when he was resigned. It said he went 17-17 against Michigan. He was 8-5, 6-4 against Penn State, and 3-8 against Ohio State, which is better than you think.
Yeah.
When you think of how dominant Ohio State's been. So 17-17, 500 record against those 3. But if there's a but there, it's he did take advantage of Michigan being a mess and Penn State being under sanctions. Tucker walks into a situation where Michigan's still operational. They're a lot better than they were, and they're better than Michigan State, and Penn State's better than Michigan State. I'd actually think Penn State's a bigger threat to Ohio State in the short term than Michigan is.
Oh yeah.
And it's fared out that way the last couple of years.
Yeah.
So all of those things are working against Michigan State, where I think as a program currently they're probably closer to Indiana than they are Penn State and Michigan.
Okay. Last question. You can give me a 2-word answer if you want to on this one. You watch the entire nation, as I like to say. You're an omniscient reporter. Give me one name or a position you're intrigued about Ohio State, what they've got to get settled, in your opinion, in spring to really maintain, so to speak, to show that they're going to be, once again, a viable college football playoff contender. What is that one position or that one player that you think needs to step up and show he is that guy, or that position has been fulfilled?
Well, one guy, I mean, I kind of talked about him earlier. I think, does Garrett Wilson become a Biletnikoff candidate? Does he become All-American? And you've seen so many good receivers come through Ohio State over the years. When they flash through my head, it's like David Boston, Terry Glenn. Yeah. You get into, some of the guys Tressel had, like Michael Jenkins. They've had so many good ones.
Chris Carter was pretty good.
Right. And is he going to be that kind of player?
Yeah.
Is he going to be that kind of difference maker? And if he is, how much faster are those other guys around him going to develop? Because there is you said it earlier about recruiting class they had at receiver and the depth they've had at that position. And I was talking a little bit about the combine development where McLaurin and KJ Hill and, it's on and on and on they go. Could this be the best receiving core in the country? Because this leads to my next point. LSU had that last year.
Yeah.
LSU had they were a cheat code on offense with Jefferson and Jamar Chase and Terrace Marshall and Thaddeus Moss and Hilaire. If Ohio State has that at receiver, they could be that cheat code offense that nobody can stop, and you can win a national championship with that pretty easily.
And what LSU had going for them too is, speaking of cheat codes, they had a guy playing quarterback who was reading defenses like a first grade primer, book. I mean, it was crazy, the poise that Joe Burrow showed in the toughest situations and found the open guy, And when you couple Garrett Wilson with Chris Olave, and then intersperse these other guys, I mean, that's a pretty formidable looking passing attack on paper. And Jeremy Ruckert up the seam, ladies and gentlemen. But anyway.
Exactly. And if they have that, they'll be good enough to win it. So that's what the position I'll be watching, and definitely the player I'll be watching, because I think he has that opportunity.
Gotcha. Ladies and gentlemen, much thanks. Much appreciate my friend. Pretty much we're bordering on being longtime friends now, right, Bill?
It's been a while, man. And anytime you can have me on, I appreciate it. And it means a little bit more to me to be able to come on here. I mean, being a local kid, being a Lancaster guy, and living in that Pickerington, whatever you want to call it. It's really competitive here, and a lot of fun to live here.
Well, they're going to rename that Jack Sawyerville, aren't they? Maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe that's coming.
I tell you what, I got a quick Jack Sawyer story for you. He's just a guy that, we were out at one of the local breweries, and my son was with me, and as you know, he's 9 and coming up through this system, and we saw Jack, and Grant went up and said hi to him, and I just thought it was going to be a hi, and then ended up being like a 10 to 15 minute conversation, because Jack was willing to take that time out of his day and just talk to Grant and his friends, and just a really good kid. And I'll definitely be rooting for him when he comes to Ohio State, because the Buckeyes are going to get a good one there.
Wow. Well, ladies and gentlemen, there's insights you don't get just every day from Bill Bender, Sporting News, longtime friend of mine, and we definitely have him on quite a few more times, because he enlivens the show, but mainly he enlightens the show, as far as I'm concerned, about what's going on other than at Ohio State, but also he's plugged in with Ohio State too. So until next time, this is Tim May, and thank you very much, Bill Bender. And we'll see you next time on the Tim May Podcast.
Hey, thank you.
Thanks for watching. Subscribe below to get the latest videos from Lettermen Row.
We got Letterman Live, we've got the practice report, we got rapid reaction. Hey, and we got Buckeye IQ with Zach Bourne.
For sure. We got recruiting breakdowns with Berm. We got whatever you need. Ohio State football and Ohio State athletics, we've got you covered here at Lettermen Row.